When I walked into my son's engagement party and saw the seating chart with my name listed under staff table, I knew exactly what the Blackwood family thought of me. Margaret Rose Williams, the seamstress who wasn't good enough to sit with real guests. They had no idea that the woman they dismissed as just the help was about to teach them a lesson about respect that would reshape their entire world. If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This story begins 8 months before that devastating evening in September, when my son Daniel first brought home Isabella Blackwood. At 31, Daniel had always been drawn to ambitious women, but Isabella was different. She came from the kind of Boston Brahmin family that traced their lineage back to the Mayflower and never let anyone forget it. The Blackwoods owned textile mills across New England, their name carved into the cornerstones of libraries and hospital wings throughout Massachusetts. When Isabella first visited my small tailor shop in Cambridge, I could see her taking inventory of everything that didn't meet her standards. The cramped workspace with its industrial sewing machines, the bolts of fabric stacked against every available wall, the mannequins dressed in half-finished alterations for my working-class clientele. "So this is where you work," she'd said, her tone carefully neutral but her expression speaking volumes. How authentic. She picked up one of my business cards from the counter, reading it with the same fascination someone might show a museum artifact. Margaret Rose, custom alterations and tailoring. 40 years of experience. Even then I bit my tongue. Daniel was glowing with happiness, his eyes bright with the kind of love that makes people overlook red flags the size of billboards. At 59, I'd learned to pick my battles carefully. Some wars require patience, and I've always been extraordinarily patient. The proposal happened 3 months later at the Blackwood family's summer estate in the Berkshires. I wasn't invited to witness it, of course, but Daniel called me afterwards, breathless with excitement. "Mom, I proposed by the lake at sunset." It was like something from a movie. I congratulated him genuinely, pushing down the unease that had been growing since I'd first met Isabella's family. The Blackwoods had a way of making their disapproval known without ever saying anything directly. It was all raised eyebrows and meaningful glances, the kind of subtle cruelty that wealthy people had perfected over generations. The engagement party was my first real glimpse into the world Daniel was marrying into. Held at the exclusive Harbor Club overlooking Boston Harbor, it was an evening designed to remind everyone present of their place in the social hierarchy. Crystal chandeliers illuminated guests whose names appeared regularly in the society pages, people who spoke casually about their summer homes in the Hamptons and their winter escapes to St. Moritz. I'd spent weeks choosing my outfit, settling on a simple black dress I'd sewn myself. Nothing too flashy for someone in my supposed position, but elegant enough to avoid embarrassing my son. I'd even splurged on having my gray hair professionally styled, wanting to look my best for Daniel's special night. That's when I saw the seating chart displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance. Gold calligraphy on cream-colored paper listed every guest's table assignment. I found my name at the bottom of the list. Staff table, Margaret Williams, seamstress. Staff table. Not family table, not friends of the groom. Staff table, where they'd seated the caterers, the photographer's assistant, and apparently the mother of the groom. The breath caught in my throat, not from hurt. I'd expected dismissal, but from the sheer audacity of publicly categorizing me as hired help at my own son's engagement party. "Oh my," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Eleanor Blackwood, Isabella's grandmother and the family matriarch, studying the seating chart with theatrical concern. "There seems to be some confusion about your placement, Mrs. Williams." Her tone suggested she'd discovered a clerical error, but her eyes told a different story. Eleanor Blackwood was 82 years old and had been perfecting the art of social cruelty since before I was born. She knew exactly what message that seating assignment sent. "No confusion at all," I replied politely. "I'm sure someone put considerable thought into these arrangements." Her smile was sharp as winter ice. "Indeed, we do try to see people with others who share their social stratum. I hope you understand." I understood perfectly. I also understood that Eleanor Blackwood was about to learn some very expensive lessons about assumptions. But that lesson would have to wait. Some chess games require multiple moves to achieve checkmate. The dinner conversation at the staff table was actually quite pleasant. The caterers were hard-working people from immigrant families. The photographer was a young woman building her business one wedding at a time, and the musicians were conservatory students earning money between classes. These were my people. Individuals who understood the value of honest work and treated others with genuine respect. Meanwhile, at the family tables, I watched the Blackwoods hold court like minor royalty. Isabella's father, William Blackwood III, regaled guests with stories about their family's textile empire. His wife, Caroline, discussed their upcoming charity gala with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. And Eleanor, the grand dame herself, sat at the head table like a queen surveying her kingdom, occasionally glancing in my direction with a satisfied smile of someone who'd successfully put an interloper in her place. If only she'd known that the interloper had been quietly studying their family's financial structure for months. The Blackwood textile empire, for all its prestigious history, was built on increasingly shaky ground. Traditional manufacturing was dying, and the family had been borrowing against their real estate holdings to maintain their lifestyle while their core business hemorrhaged money. More interesting still, several of their creditors were subsidiaries of companies in my investment portfolio. Companies that, with the right encouragement, might suddenly decide to call in their loans. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The wedding planning process was where the Blackwood family's true nature revealed itself most clearly. Every decision was made in family meetings I wasn't invited to attend. When I offered to contribute to the reception costs, Caroline Blackwood had actually laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking crystal. "Oh, Margaret, that's so thoughtful," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But this is going to be quite an elaborate affair. We simply couldn't expect someone in your position to understand the financial requirements involved." Someone in my position. If only she'd known that my position included controlling interest in 3 of the banks they were borrowing from to fund their son's fairy tale wedding. Daniel tried to include me when he could. He'd call with updates about venue bookings and menu tastings, always apologizing for another planning session I'd mysteriously been excluded from. "Mom, I know the Blackwoods can be a bit formal," he'd say diplomatically. "But once they get to know you better, they'll see how amazing you are." Sweet Daniel. Always believing the best in people, always assuming that goodness would eventually win out over prejudice. He had no idea that his future in-laws saw his mother as an embarrassing necessity to be tolerated rather than embraced. The bachelor party preparations were particularly telling. I wasn't involved naturally, but I heard through Daniel that the Blackwood men were planning an elaborate weekend in Martha's Vineyard. When Daniel mentioned that perhaps they should include me in some family gathering to balance it out, William Blackwood had reportedly suggested I might enjoy spending time with the other ladies from my social circle, by which he meant the wives of tradesmen and service workers, people he considered appropriate company for someone like me. The bachelor party weekend came and went without incident, but the stories Daniel told me afterwards revealed everything I needed to know about the Blackwood family's true attitudes. They'd spent the weekend at a private club where membership cost more than most people's annual income, discussing business deals and social connections that explicitly excluded anyone from my supposed background. "Isabella's Uncle Richard made some interesting comments about you," Daniel had mentioned innocently during his post-weekend report. He said it was refreshing that I wasn't marrying for money, that true love transcending social boundaries was admirable in a quaint sort of way. Wait. That word again. The Blackwood family's favorite term for anything they considered beneath their notice. The rehearsal dinner was my next educational experience. Held at the Union Club, Boston's most exclusive private dining establishment, it was an evening designed to reinforce the social order one final time before the wedding made it permanent. I arrived in my best dress, a charcoal gray suit I'd tailored myself, carrying a modest gift for the couple. The gift tables told their own story. Crystal from Waterford, silver from Tiffany, artwork from galleries whose names I recognized from the society pages. My contribution, A hand-sewn quilt that had taken me 3 months to complete, looked humble beside such expensive gestures. When Isabella opened it during the gift presentation, she held it up with the same expression someone might use for a garage sale find. "How crafty," she announced to the assembled guests. "It's so sweet when people make their own gifts. So much more personal than simply buying something valuable." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse. It was the sound of people who genuinely believed they were superior commenting on the quaint efforts of their social inferiors. Each chuckle was another entry in my growing catalogue of Blackwood family character assessments. But I smiled and applauded politely, mentally noting every face, every condescending comment, every assumption about my place in their hierarchy. Information, as Robert had taught me during our marriage, was always more valuable than immediate gratification. The wedding day arrived with typical New England autumn perfection. Golden October light filtered through ancient oak trees on the Blackwood estate, where 5 generations of their family had celebrated life's milestones. The ceremony would take place in the estate's private chapel, with reception following in gardens that had been featured in Architectural Digest. I'd chosen my outfit with the same care I'd given to everything else over the past months. A modest navy suit I'd altered myself, paired with simple jewelry that suggested respectability without pretension. I wanted to look appropriate for a seamstress attending her son's society wedding, someone grateful to be included but aware of her place. The ceremony was beautiful. Watching Daniel stand at the altar in his rented tuxedo, waiting for Isabella to walk down the aisle in her $15,000 Vera Wang gown, filled me with genuine emotion. For those 30 minutes, surrounded by flowers and music and the pure joy on my son's face, I almost forgot why I was really there. Then came the reception, where all pretenses were abandoned. The seating chart was displayed on an antique easel near the entrance to the reception tent. Gold lettering on ivory paper announced each guest's assigned table, a carefully orchestrated social hierarchy made visible. I found my name at the very bottom of the list. Table 15 Service Staff Margaret Williams, Seamstress. Service Staff. Not mother of the groom. Not honored guest. Service staff, seated with the catering manager and the florist's assistant, far from the head tables where the Blackwood family would preside over their triumph. The place cards at table 15 confirmed what I'd suspected. Each card bore a person's name and their function. James Mitchell, catering manager. Sarah Chen, floral assistant. And finally, Margaret Williams, seamstress, charity guest. Charity guest. The words were written in Caroline Blackwood's distinctive calligraphy, the same elegant script she used for all her society correspondence. There was no ambiguity here, no room for misinterpretation. They'd officially categorized me as an object of pity, someone who'd been graciously allowed to attend despite being beneath their social circle. I heard Eleanor Blackwood's voice from the head table, carrying clearly across the reception tent. "Caroline, darling, I just noticed the seating arrangements. How thoughtful of you to include the help in the celebration. It shows such progressive thinking." "Well," Caroline replied, her voice pitched to carry to nearby tables, "one must practice charity where one can. And Margaret works so hard. It seemed cruel to exclude her entirely." The laughter that followed was refined, polite, but unmistakably malicious. These people had turned my public humiliation into their evening's entertainment. I stood there for a long moment, holding the place card that reduced me to a charity case in my own son's eyes. Then I smiled, slipped the card into my purse, and walked calmly to the coat check. From there I made a phone call that would change everything. "Robert," I said when my attorney answered on the second ring. "It's Margaret. I need you to execute the Blackwood portfolio adjustment we discussed." Robert Hayes had been managing my affairs since my husband died 5 years ago, since I'd inherited the textile and manufacturing empire that Robert Rose had built from nothing. He was one of the few people who knew that the humble seamstress the Blackwoods were mocking controlled more wealth than their family had accumulated in 2 centuries. "Margaret, are you certain?" Robert's voice carried the weight of what I was asking. "The Blackwood family's financial situation is more precarious than they realize. If we call in those manufacturing loans and pull our backing from their credit lines. Do it, I said simply. All of it. Tonight. The ripple effects will be immediate. They'll lose everything. I thought about the place card in my purse, about 8 months of careful observation while these people treated me like an inconvenience they had to tolerate. Robert, what's the point of having power if you never use it to teach important lessons? After hanging up, I returned to the reception long enough to congratulate the happy couple and say my goodbyes. Daniel was radiant in his joy, completely unaware of the social minefields his new family had been placing around me all evening. "Leaving so early, Mom?" he asked, his eyes concerned. "But they haven't even served dinner yet." "I have everything I came for, sweetheart," I replied, kissing his cheek. "I got to see you marry the woman you love. Everything else is just details." Isabella appeared at his side, beautiful in her designer gown, playing the part of the devoted bride. "Mrs. Williams, thank you so much for coming. I know it means everything to Daniel to have you here." Her tone was perfect, warm, respectful, everything a good daughter-in-law should be. But her eyes held the same dismissive quality I'd seen in the rest of her family. I was a problem she had to manage, not a person she genuinely welcomed into her life. "It's been illuminating," I replied with perfect sincerity. "I've learned so much about your family tonight. Their values, their priorities, their true character." Something in my tone made her pause, but before she could respond, Caroline Blackwood appeared with a kind of timing that suggested she'd been monitoring my interactions. "Margaret leaving us so soon?" she asked with false concern. "I do hope you enjoyed yourself despite the arrangements. I know the staff table isn't ideal, but space was so limited with all our family obligations." I smiled, thinking about the phone call I just made and what would be waiting for the Blackwood family when they checked their accounts tomorrow morning. "Actually, Caroline, the arrangements were perfect. They showed me exactly where I stand with your family." Her smile sharpened. "I'm so glad you understand. It's important to know one's place, don't you think?" "Oh yes," I agreed wholeheartedly. "It's very important to know one's place. I think you'll find that lesson particularly relevant in the coming days." The next morning, I sat in my small apartment above the tailor shop, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint Boston Harbor gold. My phone would start ringing soon. The Blackwood family was about to discover what real charity looked like. At exactly 8:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. Daniel, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, something terrible has happened. Isabella got calls from lawyers this morning. Something about her family's business loans being called in. They're saying the company might be in default." I sipped my coffee, watching seagulls wheel over the harbor. "That sounds serious, sweetheart. What kind of business troubles?" "I don't understand the details, but Isabella's father is in emergency meetings with their lawyers and accountants. They're talking about selling assets, laying off workers. Isabella says this came out of nowhere." Nowhere. That was the beauty of careful financial planning. When done correctly, consequences appeared to come from nowhere while actually being the inevitable result of years of preparation. "These things often seem sudden," I said gently, "but usually they've been building for a long time. Perhaps the Blackwood family's business practices finally caught up with them." "Mom, you sound almost pleased about this." I considered my words carefully. "I'm not pleased about anything that hurts you, Daniel. But sometimes people need to face consequences for their choices. It builds character." By noon, the picture became clearer. Robert called with updates that painted a stark portrait of the Blackwood family's financial reality. Their textile business had been losing money for years, propped up by loans secured against their real estate holdings. The family's lavish lifestyle was funded entirely by credit, a house of cards that could collapse with the slightest pressure. "The morning brought exactly that pressure," Robert reported. Consolidated Manufacturing called in their equipment loans. First National recalled the real estate mortgages. Harbor Trust accelerated the business operating credit lines. The family has 72 hours to produce $18 million or face bankruptcy proceedings. $18 million. A sum that would have been manageable for the Blackwoods if their wealth had been real instead of borrowed. But as I discovered through months of careful research, the family's actual liquid assets were virtually non-existent. And their response? Yes. Panic. William Blackwood spent the morning on the phone with every contact he has, trying to arrange emergency financing. So far, no one's willing to extend credit to someone in such obvious distress. I wasn't surprised. Financial institutions were remarkably unsympathetic to borrowers who couldn't meet their obligations, especially when those borrowers had built their reputations on wealth they didn't actually possess. Tuesday brought more desperate phone calls from Daniel, each one revealing new cracks in the Blackwood facade. Isabella had been forced to cancel her planned shopping trip to Milan as credit cards reached their limits. Caroline Blackwood's charity board positions were in jeopardy as questions arose about the family's ability to meet their philanthropic commitments. Most satisfying of all, Eleanor Blackwood had been forced to put her Beacon Hill mansion on the market, the same mansion where she'd held court for decades as Boston society's unofficial queen. "Mom, I don't understand how this could happen so fast," Daniel said during his third call of the day. "Isabella says their family has been successful for generations. How does a business just collapse overnight?" "Businesses don't collapse overnight, sweetheart," I explained while pressing alterations for Mrs. Chen, one of my regular customers. "They collapse over time, and the people running them either don't notice or refuse to acknowledge reality until it's too late." "But you sound like you know something about business. You're a seamstress." The hurt in his voice made me pause. Daniel had never questioned my simplified version of myself, never asked why a woman who supposedly struggled financially could afford to send him to private school and Harvard without loans. "I've learned things over the years," I said carefully. "Your father taught me quite a bit before he died." This was true, though Daniel didn't know the extent of what Robert Rose had taught me during our 27-year marriage. He'd been away at college when Robert died, and by the time he returned for the funeral, I'd already made the decision to live simply, to hide the vast fortune my husband had left me behind the comfortable fiction of the struggling widow making ends meet through skilled needlework. Wednesday brought the call I'd been expecting. Isabella herself, her voice stripped of its usual confident charm. "Mrs. Williams, I wonder if we could meet for coffee. There's something I need to discuss with you." We met at Tony's Diner in Cambridge, a working-class establishment where a woman in designer clothes would stand out like a peacock in a henhouse. Isabella arrived looking haggard, her usually perfect appearance showing the strain of 3 days in financial hell. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the cracked vinyl booth across from me. "I know this might seem strange, but I'm hoping you might have some insight into what's happening to my family." I ordered coffee and apple pie, taking my time to respond. What kind of insight could I possibly offer? "I'm just a seamstress." "That's just it," she said, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "Daniel mentioned that you made some comment about businesses collapsing over time. You sounded like you understood more about finance than most people would expect." "I read the newspapers," I said mildly. "I pay attention to how the world works. It's surprising what you can learn if you're curious enough to ask questions." She studied my face, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time since we'd met. "The timing of this crisis seems remarkably coincidental. Everything was fine until..." "Until what?" "Until after the engagement party." Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Until after my family treated you like hired help instead of family." I sipped my coffee, watching her work through the implications. Isabella was sharper than her parents, more willing to consider possibilities that challenged her worldview. "That's quite an accusation," I said eventually. "What makes you think someone like me would have the power to cause financial problems for a family like yours?" "Because I spent last night researching every company that pulled their support from us. Shell corporations, investment partnerships, holding companies. All very sophisticated financial structures. And all ultimately traceable to one source." She pulled out a folder thick with papers, the kind of financial detective work that must have taken considerable time and expertise. "The Rose Investment Group. Every company that's destroying my family is connected to an investment group founded by someone named Robert Rose. The silence stretched between us as I considered how much to reveal. Finally, I nodded slowly. Robert Rose was my husband. Isabella's face went white. Your husband was Robert Rose. The Robert Rose who built the Rose manufacturing empire. Among other things, yes. But that means you're. She struggled to form the words. You're one of the wealthiest women in New England. I smiled, thinking about the staff table placement card still tucked in my purse. Wealth is relative, Isabella. It's not about what you have. It's about what you do with what you have. You've been playing us from the beginning. Playing you? Well, I've been watching you, learning about the kind of people my son was marrying into. The results were quite educational. I leaned back in the booth, studying her face. Did you know that your grandmother seated me at the staff table at your engagement party? That your mother labeled me a charity guest? That your entire family found it amusing to publicly humiliate the mother of the groom? Her shoulders sagged as the full implications hit her. What do you want from us? I want you to understand what charity actually means, Isabella. It means helping someone who needs assistance, not mocking them for requiring it. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. You have 24 hours to give me an answer. Inside was a single sheet of paper with my conditions clearly stated. Isabella's hands shook as she read them, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally resignation. You want me to work as a seamstress, to live in a studio apartment, to volunteer at homeless shelters. I want you to understand what real work feels like, what it means to earn respect instead of inheriting it, what it's like to be treated as invisible by people who think they're better than you. I'll never agree to this. I stood up, leaving a $5 tip for our waitress, more than Isabella probably carried in cash. That's your choice. But understand the consequences. Your family will lose everything by Friday. Your father will be unemployed. Your mother will be stripped of her social positions, and your grandmother will be forced to move into subsidized housing. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. Your family mistook my kindness for weakness, my simplicity for ignorance. Now you'll discover what happens when someone with real power decides to stop pretending to be powerless. I paused at the booth, looking down at this woman who dismissed me as beneath her notice. The choice is yours, Isabella. Accept my terms and I'll restore your family's position. Refuse, and by next week, you'll be learning firsthand what it means to depend on actual charity. Thursday morning brought a call from Daniel. His voice strained with confusion and growing anger. Mom, I talked to Isabella last night. She told me about your meeting, about some kind of conditions you gave her. What's going on? Your wife is learning an important lesson about consequences, I said, continuing to work on Mrs. Rodriguez's dress alterations. Actions have results, Daniel. The Blackwood family is discovering that treating people poorly sometimes comes with a price. Mom, this is insane. You're talking like you have some kind of power over Isabella's family. You're a seamstress. The hurt in his voice was real, and I understood it. Daniel had built his identity around protecting others, and now he was discovering that the woman he'd thought needed his protection was actually the one pulling all the strings. I'm many things, Daniel. Being a seamstress is just one of them. What's that supposed to mean? I set down my sewing and walked to the window overlooking the harbor. Somewhere out there, the Blackwood family was scrambling to save themselves from financial ruin, never suspecting that their salvation lay in the hands of the woman they dismissed as beneath their notice. It means that your father left me more than just this shop when he died. It means that sometimes the people you think are powerless turn out to be holding all the cards. And it means that your wife has less than 24 hours to decide whether she wants to learn about humility or experience genuine poverty. Friday afternoon brought Isabella to my doorstep. Her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans and a sweater that looked like they'd come from a department store. Her usually perfect makeup was gone. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. For the first time since I'd known her, She looked like a real person instead of a perfectly crafted image. "I accept your conditions," she said without preamble. "All of them." I stepped aside to let her into my small apartment, watching as she took in the modest surroundings with new eyes. The same space that had seemed quaint and amusing when she'd first visited now represented the lifestyle she'd be embracing for the next 6 months. "Sit down, Isabella. Let's discuss the details." She perched on the edge of my second-hand sofa, her posture rigid with nervous energy. "I still don't understand why you're doing this. If you wanted revenge, you could just destroy us and be done with it." "Revenge is temporary," I explained, settling into my favorite armchair. "Education lasts a lifetime. Your family has spent generations believing that money makes them better than other people. I'm offering you the chance to discover what actually makes someone valuable." I pulled out a folder containing her work assignments. "You'll start Monday at Rose Alterations. Yes, my shop. You'll learn basic tailoring skills, customer service, and what it means to earn your paycheck through honest labor." "Why your shop?" "Because I want to supervise your education personally. And because it will be instructive for someone who's never worked a day in her life to learn skills from the woman she dismissed as just a seamstress." Her face flushed with embarrassment. "I never said." "You didn't have to say it. Your actions spoke louder than words ever could." I continued reviewing her schedule. "Tuesdays and Thursdays, you'll volunteer at St. Mary's Homeless Shelter, serving meals and cleaning facilities. Weekends, you'll work with Habitat for Humanity, helping build homes for families who actually need charity. And the apartment. Studio 3B in this building. 400 square feet, shared laundry facility, no doorman. You'll live on what you earn at the shop, minimum wage plus any tips you might receive for exceptional service." Isabella looked around my apartment with new understanding. "You really live here by choice." "I live here because it keeps me connected to reality. When you have vast wealth, it's easy to lose touch with how most people actually live. This prevents that." "How vast?" she asked quietly. I smiled, thinking about the question Robert used to ask me. "What's the point of having money if you don't use it to make the world better?" "Vast enough to buy and sell your family's empire a dozen times over. Vast enough to ensure they never work again if I choose. Vast enough to restore everything they've lost and give them more besides, if they prove worthy of such generosity." The transformation began the following Monday. Isabella arrived at Rose Alterations at 7 a.m. sharp, wearing the simple work clothes I'd suggested. Her first task was learning to operate the industrial pressing machine, hot and demanding work that left her sweating and exhausted by noon. "I had no idea clothes required so much physical labor," she admitted during her lunch break, flexing her sore hands. "When I bought a dress, I never thought about all the people who had to work to create it." "That's the first lesson," I said, showing her how to properly measure a customer for alterations. "Every product, every service represents human effort. Respecting that effort means respecting the people who provide it." The customers were initially suspicious of Isabella. A woman with her refined accent and obvious breeding seemed out of place in a working-class alterations shop. But gradually, as they watched her struggle to learn new skills with genuine humility, their attitudes softened. Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old regular customer, became particularly protective of Isabella's education. "Child, you hold that seam ripper like it might bite you," she observed during Isabella's second week. "Here, let me show you the proper way." Sewing is about confidence as much as skill. Watching Isabella learn to accept guidance from women she would have dismissed as servants just months earlier was deeply satisfying. But the real test came at St. Mary's Homeless Shelter. The first Tuesday evening, Isabella arrived at the shelter looking terrified. She'd clearly never been in a building where the paint was peeling and the furniture was donated cast-offs. The idea of serving food to homeless individuals was so far outside her experience that she stood frozen by the kitchen entrance. "First time?" asked Maria Santos, the shelter director, a woman who'd built her life around helping society's most vulnerable people. "Yes," Isabella whispered. "I don't know what to do." "Start with respect," Maria said simply. Everyone who comes here is fighting battles you can't see. Treat them like human beings who deserve dignity, and you'll do fine. That first evening was painful to watch. Isabella fumbled with serving utensils, spilled soup on herself, and clearly struggled with the basic mechanics of food service. But what impressed me was her determination to continue despite her obvious discomfort. By the third week, something had shifted. Isabella began arriving early to help with food preparation, staying late to assist with cleanup. She learned the names of regular clients, remembered their preferences, and started engaging in genuine conversations about their lives and challenges. "There's this veteran Marcus," she told me one evening as we worked together in the shop. "He lost his housing after a medical bankruptcy. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, knows more about history and literature than most of my college professors did. How did I never realize that circumstances don't determine intelligence or worth?" The apartment living was its own education. Isabella's studio was tiny, with a Murphy bed, a kitchenette barely large enough for one person, and a bathroom she had to share with 3 other tenants. For someone accustomed to a 12-room mansion with live-in staff, it was a dramatic adjustment. "I made dinner for myself last night," she announced proudly during her 4th week. "Pasta with tomato sauce from a jar, but I made it myself without burning anything." These small victories meant more to her than any of the expensive achievements of her previous life. Learning to budget her minimum wage income, figuring out public transportation, discovering that she could find satisfaction in work that helped others. Each lesson built on the previous one. The real breakthrough came during her 6th week at the shelter. A family had arrived, a mother with 2 small children who'd been evicted from their apartment. Isabella spent her entire shift helping them navigate the shelter's resources, finding clothing that fit the children, and listening to the mother's story of job loss and medical bills. "I gave them my grocery money for next week," she told me that evening, her eyes bright with tears. "I know that sounds stupid, but they needed it more than I did. I can eat peanut butter sandwiches for a few days." "And how did that make you feel?" "Useful," she said, the word coming out with surprise. "For the first time in my life, I felt actually useful to another human being." Meanwhile, the Blackwood family crisis continued to deepen. William Blackwood had been forced to lay off 60% of his workforce, including people whose families had worked for the company for generations. Caroline had resigned from all her charity boards to avoid the embarrassment of being unable to meet financial commitments. Eleanor's mansion sale had fallen through when inspectors discovered structural problems that would cost more to fix than the property was worth. "Mom," Daniel called during Isabella's 8th week of transformation, "Isabella's family is talking about moving to Florida. They say they can't afford to maintain their lifestyle in Boston anymore. How does Isabella feel about that?" "She says she doesn't want to leave. That she's learning things here she never knew about herself." "Mom, what did you do to her?" "She's completely different now." Indeed she was. The spoiled socialite who dismissed me as beneath her notice had been replaced by someone who understood the dignity of honest work, the satisfaction of helping others, and the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. "I gave her an education," I said simply. "The kind that doesn't come from expensive schools." 3 months into Isabella's transformation, I decided it was time for the next phase of her education. I called her into my office at the shop after closing time, where I'd laid out documents that would explain exactly who she'd been dealing with all along. "Isabella, sit down. There are some things you need to understand about your situation." She settled into the chair across from my desk, her work-roughened hands folded in her lap. 3 months of physical labor had changed more than her appearance. It had given her a groundedness that all her expensive education had never provided. "Your family's financial troubles aren't accidental," I began. "They're the result of very specific decisions made by very specific people." "I figured that out weeks ago," she said quietly. "The timing was too convenient. Everything falling apart right after they humiliated you at our engagement party." I spread the documents across my desk. Corporate ownership papers, bank statements, investment portfolios. The numbers were staggering enough to make Isabella lean back in her chair. The Rose Investment Group controls over 15 billion in assets, I explained calmly. I have majority stakes in 19 major corporations, including every bank and financial institution that your family depends on. Isabella stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. You could have stopped all this any time. Of course I could have. But then how would you have learned what really matters in life? This was all a test. He nodded. The most important test you'll ever take. And initially, you failed it spectacularly when your family seated me at the staff table. But failure doesn't have to be final, Isabella. Sometimes it's just the beginning of real education. She was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what I'd revealed. Why didn't you just tell Daniel who you really were from the beginning? Because I needed to know who he was marrying. Money changes people, Isabella. It makes them see dollar signs instead of human hearts. I needed to understand your true character before deciding whether you deserved to be part of my family. I pulled out another folder, this one containing restoration plans I'd been preparing for weeks. Your family's troubles can be resolved. Your father's company can be saved, expanded even. Your mother's social position can be restored. Your grandmother's mansion can be purchased back and renovated to its former glory. Hope flickered in her eyes. What would you want in return? I want you to continue working here for 3 more months. I want you to understand that this transformation you've undergone isn't temporary. It's who you really are underneath all that inherited privilege. Isabella looked down at her hands, rough now from honest work, then back at me. I don't want to go back to who I was before. These past 3 months have been the happiest of my life. I wake up every day knowing I'm contributing something meaningful to the world. And your family? What about their suffering? They're not suffering, she said with new clarity. They're learning. Just like I did. Maybe it's good for them to discover what life looks like without unlimited credit cards and social position built on inherited wealth. This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Isabella had discovered something her expensive education had never taught her. That self-worth came from contribution, not consumption. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out a final document. Daniel doesn't know about any of this yet. About the money, about what I did to your family, about who I really am. Are you going to tell him? That depends on you. If you're serious about this new version of yourself, if you're committed to building a marriage based on honesty and mutual respect rather than social climbing and financial security, then yes. We'll tell him together. And if I'm not? I smiled, thinking about all the lessons the past months had taught both of us. Then you'll go back to being the person who thought it was appropriate to seat your mother-in-law at the staff table. And I'll go back to being the woman who has the power to make your family's financial problems permanent. That evening, Daniel came to dinner at my apartment for the first time in months. Isabella had insisted on cooking, a simple meal of pasta and salad that she'd prepared with the pride of someone who'd learned to find joy in basic accomplishments. This is delicious, Daniel said, and I could see he meant it. The food was simple but prepared with care, and there was something deeply satisfying about eating a meal his wife had made with her own hands. Isabella's become quite accomplished in the kitchen, I observed. Among other things. Daniel looked between us, sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Mom, Isabella told me she's been working at your shop. I don't understand why. Her family has money. Had money, Isabella corrected quietly. Past tense. What do you mean? I set down my fork, meeting my son's eyes directly. Daniel, there are some things you need to know. About me, about your wife's family. About what's been happening these past few months. Over the next hour I told him everything. About the fortune Robert had left me. About my decision to live simply to stay connected to reality. About the Blackwood family's treatment of me and my response to it. Daniel listened in stunned silence as I explained how I'd systematically dismantled his in-laws' financial empire in response to their cruelty. You destroyed their lives because of a seating chart, he asked finally. I taught them a lesson because they needed to learn it, I corrected. Your wife is a different person now than she was 6 months ago. She's kinder, more thoughtful, more aware of how her actions affect others. That transformation wouldn't have happened if she'd continued living in privileged isolation. Isabella reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. Your mother saved me from becoming someone I would have hated. I was turning into my grandmother, entitled, dismissive, cruel to anyone I considered beneath me. The work, the apartment, the shelter, volunteering. It all taught me who I could be if I stopped hiding behind inherited wealth. Daniel looked at his wife with new eyes, seeing the calloused hands and the genuine warmth that had replaced her former artificial polish. You really want to keep doing this? Working at Mom's shop, living in that tiny apartment? I want to keep being the person I've discovered I can be, Isabella said firmly. I want to build our marriage on who we really are, not on social positions or family money. The next morning brought the beginning of the Blackwood family's restoration. Robert Hayes executed the financial arrangements I'd spent weeks preparing, and by noon, the crisis that had threatened to destroy them was quietly resolved. William Blackwood's company received an unexpected capital infusion from an anonymous investor, allowing him not only to recall his laid-off workers but to expand operations into new markets. Caroline Blackwood discovered that a mysterious benefactor had endowed a new charity foundation in her name, restoring her social position while funding actual humanitarian work. Eleanor Blackwood's mansion was purchased by a private trust and restored to its former glory, then deeded back to her with the stipulation that it would never again be subject to financial claims. But the most important restoration was happening in my small shop, where Isabella was learning to find satisfaction in work that served others rather than herself. Mrs. Williams, said Mrs. Chan during Isabella's 4th month, your daughter-in-law has magic fingers with alterations. Look what she did with my old dress. It's like she gave it new life. Isabella beamed with pride at the compliment, a reaction that would have been impossible for the woman who'd married my son. The old Isabella would have dismissed such praise as beneath her notice. The new Isabella understood that Mrs. Chen's approval represented something more valuable than all the society page mentions she'd once craved. The 6-month mark arrived faster than I'd expected. Isabella had become such an integral part of the shop's operation that I'd begun relying on her expertise with difficult alterations. Her eye for detail and natural sense of style, combined with the work ethic she'd developed, made her invaluable in ways that had nothing to do with her family connections. I don't want this to end, she admitted on her last official day. I know I could go back to my old life now. My parents have been hinting that my experiment has gone on long enough, but I don't want to. Then don't, I said simply. You're free to make your own choices now. The question is, what kind of person do you want to be? That evening, Daniel and Isabella came to dinner at my apartment one final time before she was scheduled to move back to the family estate. But instead of celebrating the end of her ordeal, Isabella made an announcement that surprised even me. I've decided to stay, she told Daniel. Not in the studio apartment, we'll find something bigger, but in this life. I want to keep working at the shop, keep volunteering at the shelter. I want to use my family's restored wealth to actually help people instead of just buying things I don't need. Daniel looked stunned. But your parents expect you to come back. They've planned a welcome home party. They can plan whatever they want, Isabella said with quiet determination. I'm not the person they raised anymore. I'm someone better. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Blackwood Industries, watching Isabella teach a sewing class to unemployed women seeking job skills. Her students hung on every word as she demonstrated techniques I'd taught her, techniques that could help them support their families through honest work. Mrs. Williams, she said, looking up from her demonstration. I didn't expect to see you here. I had a board meeting upstairs, I replied. I wanted to see how your job training program was developing. It was true. As the anonymous benefactor who'd saved Blackwood Industries, I maintained oversight of how they used their new resources. Isabella's initiative to convert part of the factory into a community education center had been her idea, funded by the company but driven by her genuine desire to share the skills she'd learned. The women are incredible, she said, pride evident in her voice. Maria just got hired at a bridal shop downtown. Sarah started her own alteration business from her apartment. They're not just learning sewing, They're learning that they have value beyond their circumstances. And your family? How are they adjusting to your new priorities? Isabella's expression grew thoughtful. It's been difficult. My mother keeps insisting this is just a phase, that I'll eventually return to my proper place in society. My grandmother barely speaks to me since I moved out of the mansion. And your father? He's different. Losing everything and getting it back again changed his perspective. He asks questions now about the people who work for him, about their families and their struggles. I think almost losing the company taught him to value it differently. I wasn't surprised. Crisis had a way of revealing character, both good and bad. Some people became bitter when faced with adversity, while others discovered strength they never knew they possessed. There's something I want to show you, I said, leading Isabella to a quiet corner of the factory floor. Something that explains why your transformation means so much to me. I pulled out a photograph from my purse, a picture of myself at 25, standing beside Robert in front of a small textile shop that would eventually become the Rose manufacturing empire. This was us when we started, I explained. Robert had a vision of building something that would employ hundreds of people, contribute to communities, create value rather than just accumulating wealth. But he never forgot where he came from. Isabella studied the photograph with new understanding. You looked so young, so determined. We were both determined. Robert used to say that money was just a tool. What mattered was how you used it to build something meaningful. I put the photograph away, looking around at the busy factory floor where dozens of people were earning honest livings creating products that served real needs. Your family forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. They began to see wealth as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. You've remembered what they forgot. What happens now? Isabella asked. Now you decide what kind of legacy you want to build. You have resources again. Your family's wealth is restored and growing. The question is, will you use it the way you did before, or will you use it the way you've learned these past months? That evening, Isabella and Daniel came to my apartment for what had become our weekly dinner together. But this time, Isabella brought documents of her own, plans she'd been developing for expanding the community programs at Blackwood Industries. I want to create job training centers in every city where we have facilities, she explained, spreading blueprints across my small dining table. Not just sewing and basic manufacturing, but computer skills, business training, financial literacy. I want to give people the tools they need to build better lives. Daniel looked at his wife with obvious admiration. This is incredible, Isabella. But the cost? The cost is irrelevant, she said firmly. We have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. The question is whether we use it to buy more things we don't need or to help people build skills they do need. I smiled, seeing Robert's philosophy reflected in Isabella's words. Your husband taught me that true wealth comes from creating value for others. It sounds like you've learned the same lesson. 3 months later, I received an invitation that made me laugh out loud. Eleanor Blackwood was hosting a charity gala at her restored mansion, and for the first time since I'd known the family, my invitation was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Rose Williams, Honorary Chair. Honorary Chair. Not staff table, not charity guest. The woman who'd once dismissed me as beneath her notice was now acknowledging my position as an equal, or perhaps as a superior whose favor she needed to maintain. I arrived at the gala wearing a gown I'd designed and sewn myself, elegant black silk with hand-beaded details that had taken me weeks to complete. It was beautiful without being ostentatious, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of genuine taste rather than desperate display. Margaret. Eleanor greeted me at the entrance, her tone carefully respectful. Thank you so much for coming. Your support means everything to our cause. Because 6 months ago I'd been the charity case. Now I was being courted as a potential donor. The irony wasn't lost on me. What cause are we supporting tonight? I asked politely. Job training for displaced workers, she replied without apparent irony. Isabella's program has been so successful that we're expanding it statewide. We're hoping to raise funds for new facilities and equipment. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, noting that the serving staff was being treated with genuine respect rather than invisible disdain. Isabella's influence on her family's attitudes had apparently extended beyond her own transformation. "How wonderful," I said. "It's so important to help people develop skills that will serve them throughout their lives." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, though something in her expression suggested she was still processing the reversal of our positions. "Isabella has become quite passionate about these programs. Sometimes I hardly recognize her. Change can be very positive," I observed, "especially when it helps someone discover their true potential." The evening's program featured Isabella speaking about the job training initiative with a kind of authentic passion that no amount of inherited wealth could buy. She told the assembled donors about Maria, who'd opened her own bakery after learning business skills at the program. About James, who'd moved from homelessness to steady employment as a machinist. About Sarah, who'd discovered a talent for fashion design and was now studying at the Art Institute on a scholarship the program had helped her secure. "These aren't charity cases," Isabella told the crowd, her voice carrying clearly through the mansion's ballroom. "These are human beings with unlimited potential who just needed someone to believe in them and give them the tools to succeed." As she spoke, I noticed Caroline Blackwood dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The woman who'd once dismissed my handmade gifts as crafty was crying over her daughter-in-law's description of teaching others to craft better lives for themselves. After the speeches, Isabella found me on the mansion's terrace, where I'd stepped out for some air and reflection. The same gardens where I'd once been relegated to the staff table now felt like neutral ground where we could speak as equals. "How did I do?" she asked, settling beside me on the stone balustrade. "You did what your husband would have been proud of," I said. "You used your platform to shine light on people who needed to be seen." I meant what I said in there, about them not being charity cases. I was the charity case, someone who needed to be saved from her own ignorance and cruelty. I looked at this woman who'd married my son, seeing not the shallow socialite I'd first met but someone who'd discovered her capacity for genuine contribution. "And now I understand what you meant when you said wealth is about what you do with what you have. My family has resources, but for generations we've used them primarily to maintain our own comfort and status. I want to use them to build something that outlasts us." "And Daniel, how does he feel about this new direction?" Isabella's face lit up with genuine happiness. "He's incredible. He started working with the program too, using his business degree to help participants develop their own enterprises. We're partners now in ways we never were when I was just playing the role of the perfect society wife." The gala raised over $2 million that night, money that would fund job training programs across New England. But more importantly, it marked the complete transformation of the Blackwood family from entitled aristocrats to people who understood their responsibility to contribute meaningfully to their community. Eleanor Blackwood approached us as the evening was winding down, her manner more humble than I'd ever seen it. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Oh, for the seating arrangements at the engagement party. For the way we treated you throughout the wedding planning. For assuming we understood your place in the world when we clearly understood nothing about you at all." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus social maneuvering. What I saw surprised me. Real shame, real recognition of how badly she'd misjudged the situation. "Apology accepted, Eleanor. We all make mistakes when we let assumptions guide our behavior instead of taking time to learn the truth. Isabella told me about the work she's been doing, about what you've taught her. I wonder." She paused, clearly struggling with what she was about to ask. "I wonder if there might be a place for someone like me in these programs. I have organizational skills, connections that might be useful. I'd like to contribute something meaningful with my remaining years." It was a remarkable request from a woman who'd spent 8 decades believing her primary value lay in her ability to exclude others from her social circle. But perhaps that was the final lesson in this long education, that it's never too late to discover better versions of ourselves. "I think that could be arranged," I said. "Though you should know the work isn't glamorous. You'll be dealing with people who've lost everything, People who might not initially trust someone from your background. I understand. Isabella warned me about that. She said it was the most valuable lesson she learned, that trust has to be earned through actions, not inherited through family names. 6 months later, I stood in the chapel where Daniel and Isabella had married, but this time for a different celebration. They were renewing their vows, but more than that, they were publicly committing to the people they'd become rather than the people they'd been. Isabella wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself rather than a designer gown. Daniel's groomsmen included Marcus from the homeless shelter and James from the job training program, rather than just college friends and business associates. The ceremony was smaller, more intimate, focused on genuine relationships rather than social obligations. "Do you, Isabella, take Daniel to be your husband?" the minister asked, "promising to build your life together on foundations of mutual respect, honest work and service to others?" "I do," Isabella replied, her voice strong with conviction. "And I promise to never forget the lessons I've learned about what really matters in life." When they kissed, the applause came from a congregation that included homeless shelter volunteers, job training graduates, and Blackwood Industries employees alongside the society figures who'd attended their first wedding. It was a celebration of transformation rather than transaction, of love that had been tested and proven rather than love that existed in privileged isolation. At the reception, held in the community center Isabella had helped establish rather than an exclusive club, I found myself seated at the head table. Not because of my wealth, which most guests still didn't know about, but because of my role in guiding Isabella's transformation. "Thank you," Isabella said when she and Daniel stopped by my table during the dinner. "For everything. For seeing potential in me that I didn't know existed. For refusing to let me stay the person I was." "Thank you for being willing to change," I replied. "It would have been easier to stay angry, to retreat into your family's privilege and pretend I was the problem. Instead, you chose to grow." Daniel looked at both of us with obvious affection. "I feel like I have a new wife and I'm finally meeting my real mother. It's been quite a year." Indeed it had. A year that began with a humiliating seating assignment and ended with a family built on genuine respect rather than social obligation. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the community center's roof deck, looking out over the city lights of Boston. Isabella joined me there, still in her simple wedding dress but radiant with contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Living simply when you could have anything you wanted." "I have everything I want," I said honestly. "A son who married a woman worthy of him. A daughter-in-law who understands the difference between wealth and worth. A family built on love rather than convenience. And the Blackwood family. Do you think they've really learned?" I considered the question, thinking about Eleanor's genuine commitment to the job training programs, about William's new approach to employee relations, about Caroline's transformation from social butterfly to effective advocate for working families. "People can change if they want to badly enough," I said finally. "Your family discovered that privilege without purpose is just elaborate emptiness. Whether they maintain these lessons long-term remains to be seen. And if they don't," I smiled, thinking about the financial instruments still in place that could reshape the Blackwood family's fortunes as quickly as I dismantled them. "Then they'll discover that some teachers are very persistent about making sure their lessons are remembered." A year later, I received a letter that made all the months of planning and execution feel worthwhile. It was from Maria Santos at St. Mary's Shelter, written on behalf of the 53 people who'd found permanent housing through jobs they'd gained at Isabella's training programs. "Mrs. Williams," the letter began, "we wanted you to know that your daughter-in-law's work has changed our entire community. But more than that, her attitude, the way she treats everyone with genuine respect regardless of their circumstances, has taught our volunteers and clients alike what real charity looks like." The letter went on to describe specific success stories, families who'd moved from homelessness to stability, individuals who'd discovered talents they never knew they possessed, children who now had hope for futures their parents had thought impossible. But the most meaningful part came in the final paragraph. "Isabella often talks about the woman who taught her that true wealth comes from lifting others up rather than putting them down. She says you showed her that the most important charity we can offer is the chance to help someone discover their own capacity for grace. Thank you for teaching her to see people like us as human beings worthy of respect rather than objects of pity. I folded the letter carefully, thinking about the woman who'd once labeled me a charity guest and how completely she'd transformed her understanding of what charity actually meant. That evening, Daniel and Isabella came for our usual weekly dinner, but this time they brought news that surprised even me. "We're pregnant," Isabella announced, her face glowing with joy. "The baby's due in March." As I hugged my son and daughter-in-law, I thought about the child who would grow up understanding from birth that a person's value came from their character rather than their bank account. A child who would learn by example that true nobility came from serving others rather than being served. "Have you thought about names?" "Yes. If it's a girl, we want to name her Rose," Daniel said. "After Dad, and after the legacy of service you've both taught us to value. And if it's a boy," Isabella smiled, "Robert. We want him to grow up understanding the kind of man his grandfather was, the kind of person who builds wealth to create opportunities for others rather than just accumulating possessions." 3 months later, I stood in the same chapel where this story had begun, holding my granddaughter Rose while Isabella and Daniel renewed their commitment to the life they'd built together. But this time, there were no seating charts based on social hierarchy, no staff tables or charity guest labels. There were simply people, rich and poor, educated and working class, old and young, gathered to celebrate love that had been tested by adversity and proven genuine. At my son's first wedding, his bride's family had written my name tag as the charity case. They'd expected humiliation and got education instead. They'd tried to diminish me and instead discovered their own capacity for growth. Sometimes the best revenge is helping someone become the person they were always capable of being. And sometimes the greatest charity we can offer is the chance to discover that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the people we lift up along the way. The seamstress they dismissed as beneath their notice had taught them the most valuable lesson of all, that true nobility comes not from inherited position, but from chosen service to others. And in learning that lesson, they'd discovered riches beyond anything their family trust could provide. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your own experiences with judgment and transformation in the comments below. Remember, we all have the power to choose who we become, regardless of where we started. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to find their own capacity for change.